And our last speaker on this panel is Shen, who is presenting a paper entitled China's Little Arabia, a study of the impact of Arab migration to the Chinese city of Yiwu.
Thank you very much for your introduction. And I feel it's a real privilege for me to be here today because I'm not a trained specialist in Arabic studies, and also it's my first time in the United States and also to give a paper, so I feel a bit nervous to be here, especially in such a prestigious university and with a very international panel. And I want to thank the CCAS at Georgetown University for thank you for inviting me here, and Maggie and her team has done a great job for bringing everyone here, and which I'm very grateful. And so my paper today is to look at Arab migration to China, which is not a new history, actually. If we look at the historical background, that there's a long interaction between the Arab world and China already in ancient times. And what I will do today is to look at different aspects, looking at China as an immigrant country, as well as looking at Arab-China relations in a historical context. And later I will look at the new phenomenon, the issue of the case of Yiwu, how it has become a magnet for Arab migration to China. And finally, I will conclude and look at what are the impacts of Arab migration to China, and what does it mean for China and its relation with Arab world. And before, I think when we talk about China, we always think about, in the context of migration study, we always think about Chinese diasporas abroad. China is probably one of the largest countries for overseas diasporas. And when we look at United States, for example, there's a lot of overseas Chinese, what we call ABC, American-born Chinese, or in Britain, BBC, British-born Chinese. And so there are a lot of studies on that overseas Chinese studies. And also when we look at Chinese studies, migration studies, we look at China as a sending country, looking at China to North America, to Southeast Asia, with already a very established community of Chinese diasporas, but also to smaller countries nowadays, in Africa, for example. Even the smallest African country has a sizable Chinese communities. And when we look at migration between Arab and China, many people will think about the migration of Chinese construction workers in the Gulf states, which is a very, very big phenomenon in the past few decades. But what I want to do is to change your perspective into China as a net migrant country, that China actually receives a lot of migration as well from neighboring countries, like I point out, the Vietnamese brides. The case is, for example, due to the one-child policy, there's a huge gender imbalance. So like what happened in Korea and Japan, when Korean and Japanese men start to marry brides from China, from Vietnam, now China is doing the same. There are a lot of brides imported across the southern border into China to marry with Chinese men. And also when we look at the issue of a lot of students migration coming to China from Asia, from neighboring countries in Asia, as well as from Africa as well. A lot of Chinese government is very active promoting China as education destination. And furthermore, the more traditional Western expatriates as well as businessmen from Japan and Korea is also a very important part of the landscape of China as a net immigrant country when China is receiving more migrants from the outside world. The reason when I said the migration between the Arab world and China is not a new phenomenon is actually the first recorded history of the presence of Arab people in China is already in the early 7th century when we're looking at this migration, what Chinese call tashi, or for Arab, I think it's a word for Arab. And also the people from Persia also has been record of, for example, Persian ambassador going to China in the year of 713. So there's a long tradition of interaction between the Arab world and China. And I think one of the two most important channels or celebrated channels are what we call the Silk Road and the Spice Road. Silk Road is the land route when the interaction between China and Arab, and the Spice Road is the sea route when the interaction were made. And across the different dynasty of China, when we can see that there are some dynasties actually encouraged the migration from the Arab world, where some other dynasty did not encourage and even restrict migration. For example, in the Song Dynasty, there were waves of Arab migration used by the Song Emperor as a buffer zone between the Chinese Empire as well as the Northern Empire, the nomadic empire. And while in the Yuan Dynasty, which is a Mongol empire, actually the emperor encouraged greatly this Arab migration, and a lot of Arab people took very important government position or even military position in the empire during the Yuan Dynasty. And however, the dynasty later, the Ming Dynasty, we saw a declining migration from Arab world, mainly because the emperor has a very strong restriction on sea trade. So there's what we call the sea ban. So because of this restriction on sea travel, we saw a decrease in Arab migration. And finally, in the last dynasty of China, the Qin Dynasty, again, since the ruler is from Manchuria, they used the tactics to encourage, to divide the different ethnic groups in China. And so the migration from Arab world is not very significant during that period. So what are the impacts of Arab migration in ancient times for China? And we can see that the most important contribution is the trade. Arab businessmen are very important middlemen for the trade between China and the rest of the world. And they dominate the overseas trade of silk, of porcelain, etc., between China and the West. And they are also very, if you look at records, and I look at some historic records, there's a lot of noted contribution in terms of medicine, in terms of scientific fields, especially astronomy contribution, as well as musical and culinary. And so that's very important, noted contribution through these early waves of Arab migration. And probably the most celebrated descendant of this Arab migration is what we call the Admiral General. He was a very important sea voyager. He made 7 sea voyages to Southeast Asia as well as to the Horn of Africa. And he's actually a descendant from the Persian migrants. And what is also important is actually he changed his name. A lot of the Arab migrants, when they arrived in China, they changed their surnames in order to integrate into local societies. And later I will give you some examples, the name change. And if you're interested in Zheng He, there's actually a very interesting book called 1421, When China Discovered the World. And it's basically a book about his sea expedition, about how he made the history for China. Okay. So, yes, I talk about the name change. When the Arab people arrive in China, very often they were intermarried with ethnic Han Chinese, and some of them changed their name in order to have more prospects in the civil servants and in the government, in the military. For example, there's some example of name change. So you can have a surname like M.O. Mo for Muhammad, or Mai, or Mu. So they use very common Chinese names in order to be assimilated in the Chinese societies. And very often, as I said, they marry with Chinese wives or men in order to also integrate societies. And there's the time of discrimination, obviously, throughout the history of China, and also this connection with the outside Muslim world. And, but there were also exchanges as well. There were recorded that ethnic Chinese Muslim, what we call Hui, people actually made to Mecca, as well as they were also students at the university in Cairo. If I remember, the university called Al-Azhar University in Cairo, where a group of students from China actually went to study in Cairo. So coming back from the historical aspect, just to look at what the status quo of the relation between China and Arab world. After the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the relation between the Arab world and China evolves gradually. And during the 50s, I just listed some of the countries established diplomatic relations with China. We see the difference before 1971, when China was not a member of the United Nations, and after 71. So right after 71, China almost established all the relations with the Arab world. And the relation with Arab world fits very well China's geopolitical vision in the multipolarity world. So there's a balance of different powers in the world without the hegemonic powers of the United States. So China is very interested in establishing its relation with the Arab world in order to have a multipolarity. And also, without doubt, Arab world is also very interesting for China when China is very hungry for resources, the oil business, and it's a very important issue of China's foreign policy. So no wonder Chinese government has established some of the political frameworks like China-Arab Cooperation Forum, as well as a trading economic forum in the autonomous region of China, which is predominantly ethnic Muslim community. And recently, we saw intensified trade, economic, as well as education exchange between China and the Arab region. So why do I choose the case of Yiwu? Thank you for correcting me the name of the city. If you look at Yiwu, is on the coastal part of China. It's near Shanghai. It's about 300 kilometers near Shanghai. And what is important is it's very close to the sea, so there's very good logistics infrastructure. I think that is why it has become a very important trading center, and it's also close to Shanghai. So what is Yiwu famous for then? Many people think about China, you think about the Great Wall as the tourism attraction or the Forbidden City. Actually, Yiwu enjoyed one of the highest tourism destination status in China. It's not because they have a lot of heritage, a lot of buildings, old buildings. It's because of the trading business there. It is the biggest small commodities market in the world. So small commodities is everything from socks to shirts to shoes, everything you can imagine made in China. It's probably coming from this city of Yiwu. The city has about 5.5 kilometers long of shops, about 200,000 businessmen and the 50,000 shops. So just all of the people go there to buy on the wholesaler scale. And what is interesting, I'll show you another picture. That's what a regular shop looks like. If you wonder where your Santa Claus comes from, that's from you, not from Finland. Okay, and so recently it's actually started just like 10, 20 years ago, two decades ago. And if you look at, in 2000, actually, there was only 31 foreign business in Yiwu, and by the end of 2009, there were already 2,500, so the speed is very fast. And this column shows the number of foreign businessmen resident in Yiwu. At the beginning, there were only less than 1,000 10 years ago, and now there are over 12,000 businessmen from outside China based in this city. And predominantly, half of them come from the Arab world, which I will show you later. And the size of the city just grows tremendously. If you look at total population, in 2000, there were only 200,000, and now there are 2 million people in 2009. Incredible, very incredible, especially when you look at the foreigners. So Yiwu now is the most international city in China. Forget about Shanghai, forget about Beijing. Yiwu is the place to be if you want to do business. And it's also very interesting. Out of the 2 million people nowadays living there, 80% of the people do not come from Yiwu. So they're all migrants, whether they are internal migrants or foreign migrants. And if you look at the airport, half of the passengers are actually from outside Yiwu as well, outside China, to be honest. So who are these migrants? As I said, out of the 1,200 migrants, half of them are from the Arab world. The most popular country of the sending countries are the UAE, Egypt, Yemen, and Iraq. There's also a considerable number of migrants from Afghanistan, which I do not include here. And I'm trying to still work on the data because the data is very difficult to collect in this context. And especially there's a very hybrid mobility within China as well. And if just to look at the cases like Yemeni, there's some, I talked to a Yemeni business, there's at least about 300 Yemenis people. And there was also an interview with the Iraqi embassy in Beijing. They say most Iraqi people arrived after the 2003 when the war broke out. And so they arrived in China, and at least 1/3 of people out of the 3,000 Iraqi in China are living in the city of Yiwu, doing business, buying products from China to send back to Iraq. And I identify two very interesting channels of migration. The first one is what I call Middle East, Dubai, EU triangle. And a lot of people I interviewed, they actually originate from the Middle East, and they went to Dubai to do business with China, using Dubai as a regional base of importing Chinese products. And then they told me they found out it's much cheaper to actually move the whole office to EU. Then you can have a direct control of what you're buying, the quality, to deal with the Chinese government. It's much easier, it's much cost efficient. So they moved the whole office. And that's why I have an interview from here, someone from Egypt who used to working in Dubai and now going to move to EU. And the second case, I think it's also very fascinating, is what I call Africa, Guangzhou EU route. And that is for a lot of Arab businessmen from African continent. Okay, many of them moved to the city of Guangzhou in southern China, partly because of the weather, because for them it's much warmer in the southern China. The humidity, it's much nicer for the life there, and then they gradually moved to EU again, attracted by the business environment there. So I have another interview who say that, who has studied in Guangzhou for many years, then later made the move to EU as well. So I think these are the two very interesting channels which we could observe. So how do Chinese people and how do local government view this migration? This is a very significant waves of migrants to a relatively small city of China. Oh, by the way, these are just some pictures I want to show that the flourishing of Islamic food in the city of EU. You can have very established restaurants, very nice restaurant, and then a lot of street vendors actually selling Islamic food. And then they even have 2009, they have an Islamic food expo in EU just to promote the food, Islamic food in China. Okay. So a lot of the Chinese officials or the businessmen I interview, they say, oh, great, this is fantastic. All these Arab businessmen are coming to EU. They really bring all the business. They made our city more attractive. So they are very overwhelmingly encouraging this. And they say, here, business is business. We don't care whether you're European or Arab. If you bring business, it's something good. And that's the same kind of feeling I get when I talk to Arab businessmen. They say, in China it means business. It doesn't mean politics. It means business. And so someone from Yemen, he said, whoever discovered EU first will become a millionaire. So he's having his empire being built in China. And then I ask, what do you think of the politics in China? We hear a lot of the censorship, etc. They say, oh, there's no politics, it's only business. As long as I keep my business going, the government do not have any say on what I do. And also I find especially when I interview people from Iraq or Palestine, they are very emphasized on the safety environment, the stable environment China is giving. Although there's a very strong government on the top, but they feel that their lives are protected. They feel safe, much safer in China than their homelands. And also they said that after September the 11th, China opened the door for the Middle East, while the rest of the Western world closed its door. And there was a news like the Chinese office in Palestine, they give at least 3,000 visas every year for people going to China. So that's probably unimaginable in other cases. So there are a lot of business opportunities going on, and I think that's the main reason, the main attraction of these Arab migrants to go to China. And why do they also go to China? Some other reason I put a lot of them from the Arab world and from Africa, they got the scholarships at the first place, and they study Chinese because China is setting up a lot of Confucius Institute to promote the language teaching in Africa and in Middle East. So they are also students as well, and also infrastructure as well. And later I will tell you how the city of EU basically just built a mosque out of scratch, just in order to accommodate the needs, the religious needs. They also set up facilities for education for the expat children, as well as a church for the non-Muslim population, and a very vibrant social life as well. A lot of the Arab businessmen told me that they go to EU instead of big cities like Shanghai and Beijing because they are more down to earth. The Western, the Europeans, the Americans, they want to have a nightlife, in the big cities. But for them, they are more interested in doing pure business and have a more, if they have nice food to eat, that's enough. They don't care about all the bars and restaurants, etc. And so there's also a great business, catering business for catering this Arab communities, some by Chinese, some by ethnic Arabs, like this Jordanian restaurant. He actually said there's so many competitors, about 400 ethnic food restaurants in EU. He actually has to import everything from Jordan in order to make the restaurant more authentic and more popular among the communities here. And for the local communities, it's very interesting. At the beginning, I think there's a lot of curiosity. Some people, some local Chinese I found, they say, oh, there were so many people praying on the street, and we found that very interesting. We look at them, what they were doing, they were observing, and a lot of Chinese also very entrepreneur. They start to open an Islamic restaurant, and at the beginning they just say, if I don't sell pork, it's an Islamic restaurant. They don't care about all the food is prepared. So there's a mushrooming of restaurants, and then later there's a gradual learning curve. They actually start to learn what is real Islamic food, etc. That's why I said they have an expo for Islamic food in China. And also very fascinating, the local government has been promoting matchmaking agency in order to get intermarriage between the Chinese and Arab world. And I saw a newspaper article, they say the EU should really have more Arabs in the city because it helps the demographic change in the city, that they say the Arab family are usually very big and very expensive. So by bringing Arabs, we can solve the problem of aging in the city of EU. And so there's all kind of very interesting things going on. And one of the things I want to really point out is the connection with Chinese Muslim community. Before, in 1949, there were only 2 Chinese Muslims living in the city. And now there are 40,000 Chinese Muslims going to the city of EU for doing business with the Arab world. A lot of them act as interpreters, act as assistants for Arab businessmen in the city of EU. So there's a whole chain migration drawing from the Chinese Muslim community to the city of EU and to work. And I think that's very fascinating. And okay, I will conclude very soon. This is what the mosque they have built. It only took less than a year to build the mosque. I think it's unimaginable elsewhere, and especially there's no need for planning permission or anything. They just find a place and then they built the mosque. And before the Muslim population, the Arabs, businessmen in EU, they have to go to different hotels, to different venues in order to pray. But the government have decided to build a mosque and to find an old factory and basically change to a brand new mosque. And every week there are about 7,000 prayers. And 7,000 prayers, that's even larger than the biggest mosque in China, which is in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. So that's really a very high number of prayers. And some people actually I saw some online comment, they say, why should they build a mosque? We should have this, used to be a factory, why don't they open new factories to create employments for Chinese people rather than building a mosque? So there's kind of debates from a local community. Not everyone is happy. But what is also interesting that this mosque creates a venue for exchange between Chinese Muslim or converted Muslim with Arabs as well. So this is a very interesting place for you, as you can see that although 60% are foreigners, but there's a very large percentage of Chinese as well. So I will conclude say that this is very much a work in progress. I'm sorry I have been going very fast on my research, and I'm still in the stage of finalizing, transcribing the interviews and collecting more data. But if you look at comparing the ancient waves and the current waves, we can observe 3 commonality. The first one is both the ancient waves and current waves is very commercial oriented. It's more business as the main reasons for this migration. And the sea transportation, the water transportation has been always the main logistic channel. And secondly, it is a very long duration of séjour. A lot of people I interview, they all intend to settle in China. There's actually very strong motivation because they are married, they have their kids, they actually want to live in China. Again, that's the same in the early times, when the early Arabs migrants to China formulated the Muslim population in China. And thirdly, there are also very important implications for the Muslim communities in China, as we see in the case of the Hui minorities, how this has linked with the migration within China. And just finally, I want to say that this new wave of migration is what a very good indication of global nexus of trade and the migration, and shows China has now become a magnet for international migration rather transcending the country. And it has very strong implication for China's ethnicity, religious, as well as the identity of China. I think this, I already tried to show you some of the topics in my presentation. And in the long run, it also have very strong implication for China's relationship with the Arab world on the whole, okay? So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.